So this is, what is this, episode 5?
Depends if you count the religion one or not.
No, I thought we'd done 4, right?
Yeah.
So this is the 5th one.
Yes, that's right. But unless you count the religion one.
That didn't happen.
No. All right, episode 5. Maximum freedom, minimum government. We're going to do libertarianism today.
Yeah, libertarianism and all the other sort of interlocking ideas, I guess, about all that's wrong with the government and how it needs to be done away with and or minimized.
Yeah, maybe we should give a quick rundown of what libertarian is for our listeners that maybe aren't as familiar with it.
Well, I'm not really all that familiar with it myself. I mean, personally, I don't know any libertarians. I mean, I know people who think the government is corrupt, and I know people who want taxes to be lower. But, like, the philosophy of libertarianism as sort of a coherent system of thought, I don't really know anyone who subscribes to that. But, within it, there's so many common arguments that I hear all the time.
Yeah. I used to debate this libertarian fellow that I knew a few years ago, and it was funny because originally I thought that we were completely on the same side because we would talk about how people are oppressed and that there are these big forces at play that are keeping people down, and for the longest time I figured like, wow, this guy is a socialist, and we can totally be on the same level. And then all of a sudden I realized that when he was talking about the man, he was talking about the government. He wasn't talking about corporations or like private interests or the ruling class. When they say the man, they mean the government, and it's a totally different trip. Like, it's all about they would almost prefer not to see a government at all. Well, that's more anarchist, I guess. But
see it. Yeah, I think the ideal situation would be a government that is of such a character that you could live your whole life and not see it. It's not that it doesn't exist. It's that what it does is all things that have nothing to do with the average citizen whatsoever.
Well, how about we take it right from the horse's mouth? What do they want? The 3 things they want: police to protect you from criminals,
the army
to protect you from foreign invaders,
and civil courts usually. Although, like, the problem with libertarianism, with a lot of philosophies, is there's a lot of variation within it. So some of them want criminal courts, right? So the government would be charging people for committing certain crimes. Other libertarians say, no, we should also just get rid of the criminal courts, and every court case should be a civil matter between individuals.
Right. Yeah, well, libertarian essentially is just, they think the individual is paramount, that your personal decisions are paramount to everything else, and anyone that tells you what to do
is restricting your liberty in some way, and that is the fundamental ill, essentially, in all of human history.
Yeah, and that, if we just got rid of the government or got rid of all those, like the Department of Education and Social Services and Healthcare,
and
that
any
society would somehow be better.
Any other thing that oppresses people, although within sort of, I guess, American libertarianism, it's entirely to do with the government. There isn't really much to talk about regarding, say, businesses or corporations, because if we're talking about individuals, like if the distinction is that the government is not an individual because it's a group of people, it's sort of an abstract agency, and only individuals have rights, and only individuals have interests that deserve to be recognized and treated as such, then things like corporations or joint ownership or marriages should have also been included in the criticism of the government, but they generally are left out.
Well, the whole reason that we're doing libertarianism at all, because it is kind of an obscure political philosophy, but it's very popular these days, especially in like the computer world and like Silicon Valley and like the tech industry. Libertarianism is one of the most popular philosophies. Like on Reddit, for example, huge libertarian basis there, like very, very popular ideas. I think because the tech industry, IT, is one of the few, maybe the one industry left other than illegal drugs where an individual, through the basis of hard work, can start a company that is successful. all of the other industries, like you can't just start an oil refinery business. Like there's no way that an individual could possibly have that much capital to begin with, and you're going against these vested interests. And I mean, IT still has, you have your big giants like Google and Yahoo and Apple, but any guy off the street with enough startup capital,
if he works hard enough and has a good idea, there is still a decent chance that hard work and good idea will lead to something. And that, I guess what you're saying is that environment sort of promotes these ideas.
Yeah, precisely. And I think that a lot of, like, say, startup tech companies would probably find themselves restricted by the existing government regulations and, well, we could be a successful startup company, but I have to pay my employees X amount of dollars and whatever.
Well, it's not just that. I mean, it's, with the tech industry, a lot of it is also about freedom of speech and things like that. And generally speaking, whenever the government, whether in the States or here in Canada, has involved itself in the internet, it's generally been for the worse.
A catastrophe, complete, utter ineptitude on every level.
Yeah, that their idea of dealing with the internet is to essentially try to hobble it and hope that it isn't really all that different from, say, radio or television.
Yeah, and they want to make it like radio and television because it also happens to be more profitable that way for companies.
Which is, I think, where a lot of the contradictions in this kind of thinking end up. Because, I mean, if your argument is that freedom of speech is something that that the government can restrict on the internet, then why can't private interests restrict that freedom on the internet as well?
They could do it even better. I mean, have you seen some of the plans for, the new internet where you have to, not unlike a cable subscription, where you have to pay extra money for certain websites to access, or for channels, but they would have it for websites where you could get, the YouTube package, where you get YouTube and Hulu and all these, and, why can't I just access it anyway? They're just they want to put arbitrary restrictions on it, so
that people pay more.
Yeah.
Right, well, that's simple enough. I think that the internet is popular because it doesn't have those restrictions.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything, inherently amazing about the internet. It's the fact that we're able to access essentially whatever we want through it.
Right.
It's not like the content is, page for page superior to anything
Probably
else.
quite the opposite, actually, if you can count everything on the internet.
Yeah.
Well, I think that libertarianism is almost they say that the reason why we're having all these problems in society and the economy's not working and things are falling apart, they say that it's because, we're not capitalist enough. We have too much government control. We just need to let corporations do what they want more. But it's precisely the fact that we have let corporations do what they want that has gotten us into this predicament in the first place.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, but specifically with the government, I think that it's Ben, you might not know this, but it's possible to buy off politicians. And I know, it's a shocker, but if you have enough money and influence, you can use that money and influence to obtain legislation, as it's called, that favors your interests.
You don't say.
I know. It's quite a revelation. However, what confuses me about this regarding libertarians is that system of essentially corruption and pork barrel spending, that kind of crap, is entirely consistent with the free market. They're buying politicians with the money they have.
It's a business investment.
Yeah. So what's the problem? So the politicians make new laws that are complicated and convoluted, and then they try to pander to the voters by making new laws that do the things people actually want, and then corporations either get those laws changed or they create more loopholes. And so you end up with a legal system that is needlessly complicated and somewhat ineffective.
Right.
So what? These businesses don't care about the public debt. That's our problem.
Well, I find it interesting how libertarians, maybe not all of them, but some of them really antagonize some of the bigger corporations that are
Yeah.
really, because they lump them in with the man. Their huge companies are preventing smaller businesses, like maybe the ones they own, from succeeding. But
That's the only reason to be a big business.
yeah, exactly.
There's no other reason. It's not like, you really want like that your name on a plaque somewhere, like top 100 businesses in the world. No, it's so that you have the clout and the power to basically dictate whatever market you're in.
Libertarians look at like Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, and they see the differences between the sort of small-scale marketplace world that Adam Smith talked about in his great work, and they compare that to the absolute antithesis of that, which we see today, which is big business and like monopoly capitalism. And they think that, well, the reason why we don't have that, the kind of capitalism that Smith talked about, is because we've strayed from those principles and we've allowed government to take over and do its things. But so in a sense, it's like they are a reaction to the contradictions in capitalism that have happened precisely because of the free market. Like that, if you let a free market just do what it wants, monopoly capitalism will eventually happen, because certain companies will build up enough capital that they have a strategic advantage over others, and that will just perpetuate and continue and get worse and worse and bigger and bigger.
And the only way to stop that in the context of capitalism is regulation.
It's a government,
which only inhibits creativity.
Well, in their
view, that's what I mean. But that's like the solution to a problem is a worse problem, so let's just ignore the first problem.
And get rid of the government.
Yeah, get rid of the government and hope everything just sort of works out.
Yeah, but I mean, to me it seems insane to think that, I mean, it only stands to reason that the existing corporate powers would just get more powerful and fill the vacuum.
Well, or they would just take on the role of a state and just essentially in time become their own states.
What is 2 + 2, kids? Pepsi-Cola! Yeah. That's correct.
Well, this is another problem I have with libertarianism, is that they want to undermine what is generally perceived as the legitimacy of the government. They want people to not look at the government as the sole arbiter in society.
Mm-hmm.
So they're sort of treated as just another group of people imposing themselves on us, like a gang or some kind of criminal element.
Cartel or whatever.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah. Things like that. The problem, though, is that by doing that, they kind of make a complete hash of whatever society is supposed to come after we sort of destroy the current way government works. Because anyone can do that. Any person can come along and impose themselves on someone else.
Well, we watched that video of the libertarian fellow explaining their views.
Some of it, yeah.
And it all came down to two principles. It was, personal liberty and freedom, and not harming others. So if there is no government there to stop people from committing crimes, or if the government is so scaled back and ineffective that it is, in a sense, castrated, then who's going to stop people from exercising that power?
Well, they're just not supposed to do it. You see, it's like any political philosophy where when you start with principles, it isn't really about results. It's about the principles.
Well, yeah, I mean, libertarianism seems inherently idealist to me. Not in the sense that not in that most people
that they're concerned with that ideas and not
material reality.
Yeah.
And not to say that they don't have high hopes. That's what most people view the word idealist as. But I mean philosophically idealist. That it starts with the idea and these principles and these sort of abstract principles that they run up against reality instead of just looking at reality and
things aren't the way they want them to be. So how do we make things better? And that would be kind of a more trying to deal with reality kind of way of looking at things.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, it's individual freedom, which essentially just means private property and not harming other people.
somehow.
first, I guess.
Yeah.
That those are what really matters, and that's it. You just start with those principles, you carry on, and whatever the actual result of society is, almost doesn't even seem to matter. Whether or not people will actually be happier in a society where those two principles are taken as sacrosanct doesn't even seem to enter into their minds.
Well, I think it does enter into their minds because in their view, they believe that more liberty
People would be happier?
That just things would just be better generally.
Well, then why not say that? Why not just say we want a society that is better generally? Because if that is what you're actually going after, then the issue of private property and not harming other people is secondary.
Right. I guess so.
It's just a tactic to achieve a better society, and however you want to define that, whether that's better conditions or longer lifespan or just like people are just happier generally somehow, then they should be trying to deal with that. But I do think that they've clearly identified what it is they're really interested in, and that's private property primarily. Now, this is not so much the case in classical libertarian philosophies that are more anarchistic in their ideas, but I think what we're really talking about here is the libertarian philosophies that that distinguish themselves by putting a singular importance on private property, and everything else can just go to hell for all that they seem to care.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Libertarian Party of America wants to abolish the Department of Education.
Well, I'm sure they wanted to. I'm sure in principle they want to abolish or demolish every single department.
Well, except for the three that they mentioned: police, military, and courts.
Yeah.
But aren't those the three most oppressive branches of government?
I know. When you think of government oppression, when I think of it, I do think of the the soldiers, guns, and jail cells.
Yeah, I don't think of like public school teachers, for Christ's sake. Like, how is that oppressive?
Well, they're implying by saying it's oppressive that people have to go to public school, but they don't. They can get homeschooled. They can go to private schools. There are options, and whether or not those options should exist is a debate on their own. But currently, in the United States, there are things you can do to educate your children so that they never have to know anything but what you want them to think.
I find it funny because we have almost had more liberty than ever before. I mean, that's not to say that there aren't some insane laws. In like a lot of places in the States, homosexuals can't get married, and there's all sorts of stuff that's wrong with the law. But we have more access to information than ever before. Mm-hmm. We have more choices. I mean, there's more diversity than ever. There's a plurality of ideas, and I just don't understand why they think that is the issue. Like, we have plenty of liberty. That doesn't mean that we couldn't have more, but I don't see how they could view it as the center of all evil.
I think that there is a perception that there is a fundamental unfairness to giving people things they don't deserve.
Right.
Regardless of how that improves their lives, regardless of how it improves, say, their ability to be well educated or to be able to communicate with people. The government shouldn't give people things just because they want people's lives to be better. That just makes society more morally bankrupt.
And dependent on government.
And it comes down to this issue of morality every single time, where it ends up being, well, it doesn't really matter if it's cheaper to have social services than police officers.
Right.
That doesn't matter. It was never about money. It was about morality. People deserve to be in prison when they break these laws.
Or they deserve
They don't
to be
deserve
poor when...
to have an education for nothing. Things like that.
Yeah, and it's funny. We were actually just looking at the libertarian quiz online to see how close to libertarianism you are. And they contrasted libertarianism with big government people. Statists, yeah. And like
it was basically just a laundry list of everything they don't like about everyone else in society. And the problem with it was that it was this incoherent collection of unpleasant ideas that no one actually adheres to. So you have libertarianism, which has formulated society in a relatively simple way that, liberty is the primary thing, personal freedom is the primary thing, and then they've created this kind of like mirror image philosophy that no one actually has, and then they say there are certain people who believe it. Effectively, to some varying degree, everyone else other than libertarians.
Right. Well, like, let's take, for instance, on another note, welfare. Like what you were saying before, like, they want to get rid of welfare checks because people don't deserve this money, and like, why should you just give government handouts that make people dependent on government? Like, that is fucking irrelevant, okay? The reason why we have welfare is because it makes society better generally, and it's cheaper to give out welfare than to deal with the consequences of not doing it. It is a smart economic policy. It helps society, and it makes your street safer that everybody lives on. It mitigates homelessness and poverty, and it makes society a safer and more stable place overall, and that helps everyone. And that is the whole fucking point of social services to begin with. To get rid of those is insane. The main barrier to liberty in today's world is access to capital and money. If you don't have enough money, it doesn't matter how free you are, you can't exercise that freedom in a capitalist society, because keep on rocking in the free world where everything costs money. So
yeah, I mean, you don't get to access the wonders of the internet without a computer.
Yeah.
You don't live for very long if you can't afford food. I mean, that to me would seem like the fundamental foundation of liberty would be the ability to survive. But apparently it's private property.
Right. And if that private property happens to include food, then lucky you.
Yeah, if you just happen to own a pair of shoes, then you better start boiling them, I guess.
Yeah. And that I don't get. A libertarian would likely argue that if you get rid of these barriers, then society will get more wealthy generally. But I think that evidence stands to the contrary.
That's such a weird argument, though. I mean, they would say that, well, individuality, focusing on the individual, is good because the group does better.
That's like trickle-down economics.
Yeah, but who cares? I mean, if you're a sincere libertarian, if you're a sincere person who believes that what matters is what people deserve to have, and what people deserve to have is their own private property, then it doesn't matter if society as a whole is better off following your philosophy.
Right. As long as the
individual, however that works, gets whatever it is they deserve, whether it's starving in the street or living in a mansion, it doesn't matter as long as they get what they deserve. According to your sort of moral system.
This is why I find libertarianism actually to be kind of offensive sometimes, because how do they answer the question, well, why is Somalia so much more worse off than the rest of the world? Is it because that everyone there is just lazier?
Well, true, that's a simple answer.
That is a childish and racist answer.
Yeah, it does. It does eventually result in racism, but it is at least an answer. And it does fit within libertarianism.
Well, they don't have the Protestant work ethic in Africa.
Or whatever. They don't have a history of libertarian thought, and they really should, as evidenced by the fact that they're doing so much worse than the United States.
So I wonder how a libertarianism would view the Asian economies, like China, who are extremely repressive, but seem to be so much better at capitalism than the West. I mean, how does that work in their minds, I wonder?
I don't know. I'm sure. I'm sure they would be highly critical of China for its oppressive behavior towards its citizens. It might be even incidental to them that their economy is doing so well.
But isn't that the mark of the progress? For them, like, if the economy is doing better, there's more wealth being created.
Yeah, sort of. I guess. I mean, it does seem to be more of a moral issue than an economic one quite often.
Right.
I do think there is a fundamental hypocrisy to it in that libertarianism is obviously being used by certain people to forward their own personal economic interests.
Yeah.
And that it's not just some sort of thoughtful philosophy that just blossomed out of modern society.
Well, I mean, we have to mention here the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers are libertarians. Okay, they're not these like.
Oh, are they?
Oh yeah, they're not these like whack job conservative religious types. Like they've I could be wrong, but I believe they invested or donated a lot of money to like pro gay marriage groups and like sort of socially progressive quote unquote causes, and yet are the chief financiers of the Tea Party movement. Right? They're using their political clout for their own advantage. Yeah, they're not like conservatives in the traditional sense of the word, but they are co-opting the conservative culture in the United States
Or at least
to meet their own ends.
Well, at least trying to. I don't think they're going to have a good time in the long term. There's way too much populism. I think there is in libertarianism. There's definitely kind of a populist bent to it.
Right.
That it's the people who are currently in power that are screwing everything up.
Right.
And we need to get rid of them. So you'd be inherently hostile towards people like that just because of the fact that they're buying off politicians and they're taking part in the system itself that is so corrupt and bloated and incompetent.
Well, they seem to be particularly adept at preventing people from thinking that, though, because
they got lots of money. It's easy to be competent when you have lots of money.
They deflect criticism on themselves towards the government. I mean, that's part of their whole libertarian bent, right?
But are they really libertarians, though? I mean, is this a sincere philosophy they're following, or is it just rhetoric in order to get tax cuts?
Is there a difference between the two things?
Well, this is the problem, right? I mean, libertarians talk a lot about, complex philosophical thought, and yet all we seem to get, in a practical sense, is just tax cuts. That's like the actual answer that is generally arrived at.
Right.
Oh, just tax cuts. We just need tax cuts. Just cut taxes.
Less regulation, no environmental regulations.
Tax cuts. However that works.
The thing that I think bugs me the most, or the thing that got under my skin the most while we've been researching libertarianism over the last few days, was that the guy that said that that they want to get rid of the Department of Environmental Affairs and are against environmental regulations because somehow that makes the environment worse. Because any business owner that owns a particular plot of land has a vested interest in protecting that land for future generations so that it can be profitable for as long as possible.
Unless it's just, what if it's just a stretch of land with no extractable resources on it? Wouldn't that just make an ideal dumping ground?
Well, the thing that bugs me the most is that we have private property now. Most land is privately owned.
Well, and yet to be fair, all land to some degree is owned by someone or some agency, but pollution does still somehow happen.
And yeah, lakes get destroyed and forests get cut down because, as it turns out, those resources that the land is on happen to be incredibly profitable. And it is more in the business person's and the landowner's interest to exploit those resources in the short-term profit market that we have in capitalism. So I have no conception as to how they come to the conclusion that getting rid of environmental regulations helps the fucking environment. Well, that doesn't make any fucking sense to me.
Maybe it won't help the environment, but at least the environment will be able to be satisfied knowing the fact that it is in a morally superior position.
Yeah, touche.
Because that's really all you'd be able to say about it. Sure, there may be more pollution in that hypothetical society, but it'll be pollution that deserves to exist
because of people's liberty.
Yeah, it's freedom.
Well, I mean, I personally think that acting altruistically is often acting in one's self-interest as well.
Sure.
If everyone takes some care of one another and we are cooperative to some degree and look out for each other's interests, then society is better generally, and therefore you are acting in your everyone's
that's really complicated, because then you have to actually look at society and figure out what it is I need to do to make society better, as opposed to just saying, well, whatever I do is my own self-interest and that's really all that counts. The results, I assume things will just be better because I'm acting the way I want to.
Well, yeah, I mean, can libertarians actually point to a particular period in history when, or like a particular government in a particular country where their ideas were working?
There's a lot of appeals to like the 18th century American, the War for Independence, the whole body of literature and thought that came out of that, and a whole number of intelligent and thoughtful people who were involved in that, writing many different things about this new kind of government they were trying to develop. And so they do appeal to that time period as kind of the golden age, in a sense, of, at the very least, American political thought. Not necessarily like that things were materially better then, but that we were on some kind of higher ground at that point, or the world even, because the world can sort of follow along with the United States in that sense.
Okay, I think the reason for that is because that era in capitalism most resembles Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations and the kind of capitalism that he was describing as the sort of ideal marketplace, because capitalism was so underdeveloped at that period of history that monopoly capitalism and the big sort of corporate thing that we see today hadn't yet had the chance to develop.
And big government that goes along with it,
yeah,
apparently.
Precisely. It's no wonder that they appeal to these sort of golden age of capitalism ideas, but to think that you can just get rid of government regulations and it would just go back to that, to me, I mean, you're out of your mind. There are forces at play that are so much more powerful than that there's no way that you could just flick a switch and
America will be the most forward-thinking country again.
Yeah, and the poor can just die or something.
Well, the thing was, to be fair, they had bigger problems than just the existence of the poor in 1776. There were some fundamental hypocrisies regarding the principles that the founding fathers of the United States held to. I'm, mainly referring to slavery.
I was just going to say, you must be referring to the fact that they were all slave owners.
Well, not all of them, but a lot of them. And it's hard to look at them now and honestly consider them to be kind of relevant in the modern day.
Yeah.
It's not to say that there's not like a wealth of interesting and intelligent debate that went on at the time, and it's worth reading what they wrote. But it's just that there are so many things that they got so wrong that it's not really worth it, to me at least, to look to them specifically as a source of knowledge and truth.
Let alone moral authority.
Yeah, I don't consider any of them to be a moral authority at all.
No, and our listeners might remember us complaining about this in our American Politics episode, which I suggest you should check out and listen.
Well, yeah, unless you're listening in order, in which case, that's the smart thing to do. Start at the beginning.
I always like listening to things chronologically, otherwise it doesn't make sense.
We don't have an ongoing narrative.
Well, we just made one.
Oh no!
Because we referenced a previous podcast.
Oh, that's not good. Yeah. Anyway, libertarianism is for all that it appeals to 300-year-old dead white men, that it is a relatively modern philosophy in politics, and
right.
And what we're talking about here, American libertarianism, is like really only since the 1970s.
Is it that old?
Yeah, I mean, I think so.
When did the free men's movement start?
Oh God, the free men, that's a whole other ball of wax. I mean, in a certain sense, they've always existed. The free individual, blah blah blah, since time immemorial, da da da. That kind of crap.
Government can't tell me what to do.
No, if I say these magic words in this correct order, then government, I don't have to pay taxes. Done. I guess that's like libertarianism on your own, because there are people who are so committed to libertarianism, to the idea that the government is evil, essentially the source of all ill, that they don't want to take part in politics. To try to get elected to government is just hypocritical to them.
Well, that's not true. There is a Libertarian Party in the United States.
Well, yeah, there are libertarians who disagree with that idea, but this is a real problem because, once again, libertarianism is not a coherent philosophy. It's just a set of principles that you either do or do not agree with, and you can pretty much just swap them out at any time with something else.
Well, I mean, they're not like anarchists who don't engage in the political process because it's against their principles. Libertarians, at least, acknowledge that there is some limited role for the government to play, and the only way, and the smart ones can acknowledge that the only way that they can possibly achieve that is by getting elected and passing some laws or
but the
repealing
government,
a lot of laws.
only exists for those libertarians that consider private property to be the only thing government needs to protect. It's not people's lives that need to be protected by the government.
Well, no, they said that police and military should be there.
They're not protecting people's lives. They're protecting private
property rights. Yeah.
I mean, if the issue was people's lives, once again, it would be a matter of figuring out how to protect people's lives and then just doing that thing. If that means social services, then you enforce and create social services because that's how you can protect people's lives.
Well, it is.
It is, but if you don't actually have a concern for people's lives specifically, and are only concerned with private property, then the only thing you really want the government to do is police, military, and courts.
You know what bugs me? Their whole thing about repealing the Department of Education, repealing, oh no, I'm just getting started, and repealing public education, basically.
Yeah.
The whole reason that we have public education at all is because it was initially a subsidy to business. The private sector, and I'm talking about like turn of the century things here, they needed a workforce that could do, could read signs, could read and write, could do basic mathematics, and those were skills that they didn't want to invest in their own workers. And so they managed to get the government to pay for public education, to give their workforce a basic level of literacy. And so public education is I'm not arguing against it, but initially it was a subsidy to the private sector. And
well, even now, I mean, you don't have to go back 100 years, but I mean, even now, a literate, educated population is more economically viable than one that isn't.
It's better for the economy. It's better for everyone if everyone can fucking read.
Yeah, well, if everyone can read well enough, it doesn't really matter. Like, it doesn't, you don't have to be creative or intelligent or, thoughtful, but just be able to do these things, then that's great. I mean, the education system is like a hodgepodge of different interests now, but yeah, it's hard to justify doing something that is so economically stupid, and it does seem a bit odd that a libertarian would be promoting such a thing, but I guess it's just going back to that they find it morally objectionable, the existence of public education.
Right.
The government has no right or role or responsibility, or however you want to phrase it, to invest my money into public education.
If my kids are going to private school, why do I have to pay for other children's to go to public school? If I didn't get sick this year, why do I have to pay for healthcare taxes? You're a fucking asshole for saying that. It doesn't matter. What if it's your grandma? What if it's my grandma? Someone has to pay for it. Does she have to pay for it out of her own pocket?
No,
I certainly hope not.
Hey, no. Don't get ahead of yourself.
I'm so mad right now.
People don't have to pay for it. People can just die. And quite often people do die because they don't get the health care they need.
They can't afford it.
Yes, well, that does happen.
Yeah, okay. Here's a good example, actually, the healthcare system, right? In the United States, you have a privatized healthcare system, and in Canada, you have a socialized one. And guess who pays like 7 or 8 times less money overall for a better public health system? We do. So how can you possibly say that privatization is the way forward here?
Well, I think they would probably say that the reason why it's so expensive is because of too much government regulation.
That is such bullshit.
Well, sure, it's bullshit, but you can always just appeal to this hypothetical government regulation or too much government, and there you're done. And I expect that if a libertarian government ever actually got into power in the United States, there would never come a day when they would stop complaining about the size of the government. It doesn't matter how small it would ever get. It would always be too big because it's like just a bogeyman at that point. It's, the economy didn't do too well this year. Well, that means we need to cut the government again. We need to make it smaller. Too much regulation. No matter how much there is, if you get it down to like a bloody note card of just government laws, it would probably still be too much.
Well, I think that libertarians remind me a lot of. There's this Slavoj Žižek documentary called "Living in the End Times," and he's presented with a quote that he elaborates on. Basically, a libertarian business government businessy kind of guy that's talking about, well, the reason why we've had the financial crisis in 2008 and all that is because of too much government regulation. Corporations haven't been able to do what they want, and that's the whole source of the problem. And he compared this fellow and his libertarian views to the kind of people who, at the fall of the Soviet Union, were saying that the USSR was collapsing not because they were too communist, but because they weren't communist enough. They weren't adhering to the principles.
The ideological purity, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And we strayed from Marx's ideas, and that's why it's falling. And no, you guys had not saying the USSR was at all similar to what Marx was saying, but I mean, in terms of communism as we know it today, I mean the USSR was plenty communist. And their crappy version of a planned economy fell to pieces because that's what it was. It wasn't. So they're like a reaction, a Puritan reaction to the contradictions in capitalism and the stuff that has gone wrong with it. And for them to say that, well, we're just not capitalist enough. I mean, we've been allowing businesses to do whatever the hell they want since the 1980s.
Yeah, but it is a matter of perspective, because they would say there's still too much government.
Right.
I mean, they just would, because it's easy to say, right? Because there is too much government. Oh, well, they're spending too much. Look at the amount of debt that the United States is in.
But the same people I was referring to in the Soviet Union would have said that, there's too much capitalism.
We weren't committed enough to, the ideology and all that.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they would. I'm sure they would have, and they probably did. But it's just that for someone who's a libertarian, it seems like it's more a matter of these ideas holding true. It doesn't really matter what the actual state of the government is, and it's kind of like this fundamental conundrum of libertarianism. It's like minimum government is necessary, and also it's unnecessary because all that really matters is the individual.
Right.
Well, if it's just individual actions that matter, then we're all individuals. We're all acting as individuals. What's the problem? The system is corrupt and it's bloated and we're spending more than we have. Well, that's what individuals do, apparently.
Well, and on another note, I mean, what if these individuals, in using their own minds, decide to work together collectively? I mean, is that against their principles?
Well, as long as it's not the government, I guess it's okay.
Right.
It's an odd fixation on the government, that the government is the only thing that really it's like it's the decisive factor. So the actual philosophy of libertarianism, for all they talk about freedom and liberty and rights, really, it's all just about what the government shouldn't be doing.
All the people, the libertarians that get into arguments online and, complain about the government and all of its ineffectiveness, they drive on roads that are maintained by their municipal government. They drive cars that meet federal standards for safety. They get on planes that are that are safe because the government has certain regulations. I mean, it is in the interests of any company to cut corners for profit. If that means if that means making a cheap engine that maybe explodes sometimes but usually works and is cheaper to produce, then they'll do that. If that means completely exploiting the resources of a plot of land for a short-term profit, they'll do that. And so I have no idea how they can conceive that individuals are short-sighted and uninformed most of the time. And to say that society would be better to just let people do whatever they want, just it flies in the face of reason to me.
Well, I mean, it's hard to it's hard to argue against that on its own. I mean, people are stupid. People are quite short-sighted, sure, but once again, it doesn't matter. It's like if we're short-sighted, then we deserve to ruin ourselves.
Right.
So that the protection we get from the government that sort of dulls our deficiencies is not deserved. We shouldn't be given the ability to survive beyond what we're able to do ourselves.
Well, it's like they almost want people to fail just to make room for the real successful people that can really get ahead.
Well, maybe they will. Maybe a lot of people will get ahead.
Maybe that's the whole reason and rationale and basis for libertarianism is just, I want to do better myself. I don't want to pay taxes for poor people.
Well, no one wants to pay taxes, but most people do.
I don't mind paying for my grandmother's medical treatment. I don't mind paying for a portion of my friend's child's public education. That's fine.
Yeah, you don't like the fact that a penny is going towards that, or however much.
Well, I mean,
aggregate.
like who's gonna pay for your grandma's hip replacement? You know, if she can't afford it, she's on.
Well, she should have saved, I guess, is the argument.
And this is why I find libertarianism to be so morally reprehensible, is because it's so fucking heartless like that.
Yeah, it does get a bit mean at times.
Well, yeah, I mean, they say like, well, we shouldn't have public health care.
Yeah, but what if more people die? And it's like, well,
they deserve
I guess.
Yeah, and that comes back to, it's all about moralism. Like, well, they deserve to die because they didn't work hard enough. Like,
they didn't think ahead.
To hell with their circumstances or whatever brought them to that point, or like whatever mistakes that anyone could.
What if someone just lied to them?
Right,
okay. Here's a simple point. Like, talking about healthcare.
Right.
The government has, as one of the many evil, sinister things it does, it regulates who is and is not a medical doctor and can practice in hospitals.
Right.
Now, the argument for that is that random fucking people in lab coats shouldn't be allowed to just open people up and stick their hands inside.
Right. That seems reasonable.
But since the government presumably isn't supposed to be regulating those kinds of things, what the hell are you supposed to do if the person you thought was a serious trained doctor is actually a complete buffoon and doesn't know what he's doing and hurts you?
Hey, well, that is a private contract between two people, and if you were duped, then that's just your own fault.
But what about fraud?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, if everything in society is just a few individuals working together by their own accord, like, well, yeah, what if someone lied to you? Does that...
am I responsible for knowing that they were going to lie to me? Like, if a company sells a bag of chips and it actually does have fat in it, what am I supposed to do? Was that a lie? Was I tricked? Was I supposed to read the back of the bag? Was I supposed to take the chips and do chemical analysis on it ahead of time? Do I just get screwed over because, well, you were stupid?
Yes, that's the answer. You do get screwed over because, as an individual, you made the wrong choice. We told you there wasn't milk in this cupcake, but there actually was. Ha! And I happen to be lactose intolerant and shat my pants. Thanks for that.
Great.
And this brings up an even more serious issue, not the shitting the pants, but the lying. It reminds me of the the 2008 crisis with all the faulty home ownership agreements that were like how the banks purposefully defrauded people of money and gave them contracts that they knew they couldn't actually afford. And I mean, that is the free market at its finest right there.
Yeah, a lot of money was made.
Shitloads of money was made. And if you let businesses do what they want, that is the kind of shit that they're going to do. And if you say otherwise, well, that is reality right there. That's what happens when you let businesses do what they want.
Yeah.
They take advantage of people that are vulnerable. So I think that it's completely asinine to think that they will just make the world a better place if they can pursue profit as much as they want.
Well, I suppose the counter argument would be that those people who got screwed out of their money should have just done their research, as the old internet adage goes.
Yeah, you know what? I think a political philosophy or a social philosophy or whatever you want to call it should be judged on whether or not it makes society better generally. And I'm sure that a libertarian would argue that their philosophy does, but we've seen the work of the free market and capitalism and how it works when it doesn't have government regulation, and it just seems to get worse.
Yeah, people tend to not do things that aren't in their interests unless they're forced to.
Well, yeah, hence regulations.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you say, the environment needs to be protected, or people need to be protected, or kept safe, or better, or whatever. But these regulations almost always were created on the basis of some serious crisis
that was happening because of a lack of regulation.
Oh, there was like a major problem with pollution, so we had to put in these environmental regulations. It wasn't the environmental regulations were created because someone just woke up one day and was like, you know what we should do? We should fuck over business just one more time.
Well, it's like the same reason why we can't just dump our garbage in the streets, because it's easier for the individual because they don't have to walk as far.
Like, we used to do that.
I know, and that's the reason why we have laws that you can't just dump your garbage in the fucking streets, because it spreads disease and pestilence.
Well, if we privatize the streets, I'm sure the person who owned that particular street corner would be quite annoyed and would probably take you to civil court. Or unless they didn't know you did it, in which case they would just have a big pile of garbage on their property.
Or maybe
what do you do?
Maybe they could just hire a militia to shoot you because that's in their own interest.
Well, no, but they're not supposed to initiate violence. But I suppose you struck the first blow by throwing a bag of garbage.
So they didn't start the fight.
No.
Yeah. Well, how does that even work in a libertarian system? Like, who starts the confrontation?
Yeah. We have clear definitions for violence when it comes to actual physical harm. But what about economic harm?
And fraud.
Fraud and harming people in ways where you tricked them specifically.
In your own self-interest to do so.
Well, it can be anything from lying to them about something. Like, let's say you throw your bag into someone's backyard, bag of garbage into the backyard because you don't want to deal with it, and they ask you if you did, and you say no. What are they supposed to do?
Both people are acting in self-interest at that point. So
yeah, they don't want this shit in their yard. It's a real conundrum for a libertarian. I mean, in the real world, it's a fairly simple problem that doesn't really need a lot of thought. But in a world where these things happen, and we don't just have the police to just give someone a ticket, then what are you supposed to do?
To be fair, libertarians do believe in civil courts and police giving tickets sometimes for limited offenses.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a fair point. They don't, well, at least not all of them, exclude the police from taking part in that kind of exchange.
Otherwise, they would be anarchists.
It would. I mean, I guess it's all sort of treated like a financial exchange, everything in society.
Right.
But what also concerns me is what exactly is supposed to happen. I mean, if you kill a person, right? I mean, is it a crime only if it causes financial harm to someone else? Or is it actually a crime all on its own? Like, if you kill a person who is, say, doesn't have a family, or doesn't have anyone who will be particularly heartbroken that they're dead, is that person's life suddenly just forfeit because no one would be there to charge you?
Well, no, because a libertarian doesn't believe in committing violence to others. That's one of their central tenets.
Yeah, well, that's all well and good, but people are still going to do it on occasion. So the question is, what happens when and if people do this?
A libertarian would say that's why we still believe in having police and courts to deal with those exceptions.
So there is a there is a legal responsibility there for the government to do what exactly? Because what is the crime? Like, if the argument is that the crime that was committed was that it was a person who was murdered, that person's life has a value outside of the property they own or the people around them who are harmed, and that life is in and of itself in some way valuable, regardless of whether or not any other individuals in society think so. If that is an actual position you're going to hold to, then why not just apply it generally and say that people's lives are generally that way, and so you need to treat society as if people's lives actually matter, and treating people well matters.
What I find interesting about libertarians is how, and we touched on this a bit before, but how they sort of want to make themselves separate from the left-right political, the difference in philosophies. And in a respect, I mean, they do combine sort of the moral and social issues of the left with the economic, quote-unquote, sensibility of the right. And I think that's how they sort of conclude that they transcend the political spectrum.
Well, I actually disagree with that. I think that I think that they specifically take the moral issues that the government treats as moral issues and disregards them. And so that from kind of a basic standpoint, issues like drug use or, marriage equality and things like that, it's not that they agree with legalization of marijuana, it's that they disagree with the government controlling marijuana.
In individuals'
choices. So it's entirely possible, and I'm sure many of them are against marijuana being sold, and against gay marriage, and things of that sort. But the whole point being that, well, it's just that the government shouldn't actually have any real point to the whole thing.
I don't know. I think most libertarians are probably socially progressive, quote unquote, if you want to call it that. I don't know, I'm sure a lot of them smoke pot and think that people should smoke pot if they want to and shouldn't be penalized for that. And I think they probably actually agree with that, the government, it's not the place of a government to make laws to infringe an individual's right to do these sort of things. But I think it's kind of ass backwards, because society is just better if you don't have these sorts of laws, and everyone benefits collectively from it. It's not about the individual, it's about everyone's lives and society being better generally.
The issue for me with regards to drugs is the people who are being put in prison for what are essentially irrelevant crimes.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that the government is illegitimate and we shouldn't be recognizing it. It's that the people who are put in jail are being treated poorly for things that don't really matter, to me at least.
Yeah.
And I think that generally speaking, we would be better off not doing that.
The irony of that is that the whole reason that people are put in jail for petty drug offenses like having a joint on them or whatever is because of capitalist interests. Because in the States you have a prison industrial complex and you have privatized prisons that sign contracts with state governments that guarantee a minimum 90% occupancy rate in their privately run prisons. And so guess what happens? The police officers end up having these fucking quotas that they have to fill and have to arrest X number of people every week in order to fill these government contracts. And so they end up putting people in jail for these stupid offenses specifically because of corporate and private interests. And it is that has caused these sorts of mass jailings of people for petty drug offenses, and is not because the government wants to put individuals in jail for these stupid things. It's because corporations and private interests and individual interests want to make more money. And that is the whole problem.
Yeah, I guess that is where we fundamentally divide on the issue of between us and libertarians, where we look at this and we look at something like prisons and we just say that it's a complete and utter matter of private interest
and profit motive.
Yeah, there isn't some nefarious government like jamming up the whole damn thing. It's people who are doing things in their own interest, and it just so happens that their interests are not in the interests of a majority of the population.
And I would also like to remind people that the whole reason why marijuana is illegal in the first place is because the cotton lobby in the United States got them to ban hemp production because it was such a more efficient business and crop than cotton.
Yeah, okay, it doesn't matter.
It does matter.
It doesn't matter.
If it's not the reason why marijuana is illegal is not because the government wants to infringe on people's personal liberty because they're evil. It's because of private interests, okay? That's the whole fucking point. And so if a libertarian is going to say, well, marijuana is illegal because government wants to infringe on your rights. Like, well, no. The private sector wants to infringe on your rights because it's in their interest to do so.
They don't spend a lot of time actually like looking into the history of any of the laws they want to repeal as far as why they were created. Not just that, I guess. It's just not that interesting to me. But like any laws, whether it's any kind of regulation or any exemption or anything at all, they're just laws. You know, it's like the libertarian just woke up yesterday and looked at the government and said, "There's too many laws. We need to get rid of them," and doesn't seem to be all that interested in why society is the way it is.
No, I don't think so. Or I agree. I mean, they think it's all about the government, but they fail to mention that most of the repression that we see is because of private interests taking control of society and corporations wanting to make more money and acting in their own self-interest, which has fucked over everyone else.
Yeah, pretty much. And I think that's all we have time for now for libertarians. We might come to it again. We didn't really talk too much about objectivism or anything like that.
That's a bit of a different story.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of infighting there between them, but maybe next time.
Well, in conclusion, forward towards a planned economy and socialism.
Yeah, large government. I'm a statist. I love everything that they don't like. The end.